Good morning, everyone. All right. So I hope everyone's having a great week. So the last few talks that I've had related to success, happiness, and optimism. And whenever I outline some ideas about how something is important, one thing that naturally follows is okay, optimism is important. I got it. Most people don't really quibble about that, but there may be a very sensible question. Well, how do I become optimistic? And this is something that I think is something that everybody needs to understand. Um, and this is going to be a two-part series. One is theoretical, and the other one is practical. And this is an old way that philosophy distinguishes things. Theoretical doesn't mean that it's not true. It doesn't mean that it's only a theory, kind of like it's a weak sense. Theory just basically means seeing the broad view in terms of ideas. Okay. Practical, on the other hand, basically means that it's something that has to do with your activities, your actions. Okay. So this two-part series is basically focusing on the idea, the understanding, and then a later talk will be about what the practice is. Okay. So how to be optimistic with emphasis on the theory, the understanding, the intellectual side. All right. So there's three steps, and then I'm going to give some examples. Um, the first step would be just to understand, to have a very broad view of the perennial questions. Perennial, think of as uh, in terms of plants, something that comes back year after year. But perennial, in the sense of human history, there are certain questions that humans have been asking for thousands of years. Right? What's the meaning of life? What's good? What are the best things to pursue? Whether or not there's a God. These are huge questions that we as human beings have been wrestling for centuries, millennia. Okay, so first step, um, understand that problems actually, this may sound crazy, but most of the problems that you have today or questions that you're wrestling with have actually had really good treatment, and in some ways have had solutions that have already been there. We like to think that we're dealing with something so unique, but as Solomon would said, life under the sun. Okay, everything just keeps happening. We have the same problems: suffering, limited resources, scarcity, um, sorrow, death. Whether there's meaning in life, the fact that there's injustice. These are all perennial questions. There is nothing new. And one thing is if you study history and you look back in the past, what is really interesting is not just that it's fun and interesting, it's that you get to wrestle with these questions with other people that have actually had it much worse than you. So, for instance, I've mentioned Viktor Frankl's book, the psychoanalyst that actually went through the Holocaust. What's interesting about Viktor Frankl is that he addressed the question of meaning, but he endured something far worse than my own situation. If I'm dealing with suffering or right and wrong, basically these big issues, and I'm reading it from somebody, say, centuries ago, that actually had a high infant mortality rate, maybe lived at a time where the entire human race was nearly wiped out by plague, things like this. When you have people wrestling with these hard issues, some people have been able to succeed in being optimistic despite having much, much worse situation. Okay, so one thing is to have a very broad view by looking at what people have actually done in terms of, say, hey, what are the real problems? Um, so like Augustine, so like 1500 years ago, roughly. The fall of Rome, the Rome, the supposed eternal city that is a very long-lasting civilization was starting to crumble. Um, and you can just imagine the turmoil that you would be in to have these sense of stability just crumbling around. What does it mean? What's the relevance? When you study humanity and life from people that have gone through much harder situations than you have, it's usually very, very enlightening. Okay, so one is study what people have actually said that have actually gone through things far worse than you. And it is itself, even if you only did step one, if you studied what people have thought and concluded, despite incredibly adverse circumstances, that's going to be enriching to you. And probably that itself would help you be more optimistic. Okay. The second one, Niebuhr, a Christian theologian, has the famous Serenity Prayer. And the Serenity Prayer is roughly something like, knowing what you can do and what you can't do. Okay? Because there's some things that we can't control, and there's some things that we can control. Obviously, it makes sense to focus on what you can control and basically know the difference. Now, the great thing about the Serenity Prayer is that it's not really controversial at all, but it is really hard to apply. Okay, but so look at the perennial problems and also try to understand what is in your control and what isn't, because you don't want to waste your energy. In fact, that's wisdom. Wisdom is to be able to apply the energy in the right ways, high value energy versus low value. You only have so much time in a day, but more successful people are able to coordinate their energies, limited though it may be, so that they can build something over time. And a foolish person basically squanders that time. Okay. All right. So step 3, and this is the hardest one, and this is actually something that this could be an entire book. Know that there is a transcendent meaning. Okay, now this sounds maybe too deep or too mystical or something like that, but it really doesn't have to. At least in understanding what the words I'm saying, it's not that crazy. Okay, transcend. Basically, think of a barrier. When you pass a barrier, you're transcending a barrier. Okay. Now, when I say transcendent, I don't necessarily mean like going from our world to God's world or our world to like heaven. That does apply, and certainly we should be considering those things. But there are many types of transcendence. Think about this. Some people could have the exact same physical experience, but have a different meaning associated with it. Okay, so for instance, you may take two people, identical situations. One has some setback, and it makes their life for the better. And somebody else, like I said, is the same thing, but it makes them, just destroys them. So for instance, in Viktor Frankl's sense, some people that had a very strong sense of meaning, they endured, they got through the Holocaust, and some of them just died internally. They were in the same circumstances physically, but mentally, they some way were able to transcend the physical space. Okay, so transcendence. I do want to talk about spiritual transcendence, and that is obviously the most important thing. But in terms of transcendence, there's many types. So, for instance, if you were able to have a rational discussion, you are doing something very, very important. You're doing something that is transcending the way that you feel. You're transcending your passions to some degree. If you can say, yeah, I'm wrong. I feel like this is the right thing to do, but I know that it's not. You're using your intellect and your mind in contrast to trump what you're feeling. You feel a certain way, but you're being irrational. So in a way, your mind can be in the driver's seat. So just being rational means that you're transcending the irrational. You are more than just an animal. You're more than just your animal drives. Okay, so there's different types of transcendence. The emphasis here, though, is knowing that there's a transcendent meaning. And this is a lot harder to do than to simply say it. Because as I mentioned, if this is a two-part series, and one would be about the theory, and then the other part would be the practice. You could know something theoretically, okay, and you could never put it into practice, okay? And I'm sure you've met a lot of people that know a lot of things, and intellectually they can give you the right answer, but you can also look at their behavior that they don't apply the things that they say. So in some sense, they know what the right thing is. They don't apply it. Okay, you could think of like religious people that might be hypocritical or something like that. But this also can apply to an academic. An academic could, let's say, you teach ethics, and you could be, very unethical. And in fact, there's actually a study that shows that if people who study ethics are actually more likely to maybe steal a ethics book. That sounds strange, but if you think about it, if you train your mind to rationalize whatever you want, you could be victim of your own um, penchant for rationalizing everything. You find a way to justify your misdeeds. You come up with some greater good or something like that. Okay, so one, broaden your mind by looking at how people have addressed these issues on a large scale in the centuries. Okay, with people that have been able to be optimistic in the most dire of circumstances. Okay, so somehow Winston Churchill was able to motivate his brethren in the UK despite overwhelming problems. I mean, things were being destroyed. Um, the fabric of the universe, so to speak, was coming apart around their ears, and somehow he was able to motivate and turn from despair into motivation, and that's pretty interesting. Whether or not you think he's a perfect person or not, the fact that you can remain optimistic in those types of situations is very important. Okay, now again, how do you get this transcendent meaning? Well, this is the trick, and this is why there'll be another talk devoted to this. In some way, you can't believe something because you want to believe it, and that's really the trick. And that's actually part of one of the reasons why education is so important. I can't force you to believe something. Okay, so if I say, well, the sky is blue and it's green, or vice versa, you you can't just believe it. Okay, you can't just force yourself by having a mantra that you know the world is a certain way when you don't believe it. So in some ways, your beliefs are incorrigible, and there's nothing I can do about that. But one thing is if you study the right types of books and the right types of ideas, you'll change the person you are because you literally see the world in a different way. And the trick is, though, if you study the world in the right way, this is another talk. What does it mean to be, studying it the right way? Is develop your general sense of rationality, how to reason. Um, okay, so let me just recap and then have some closing thoughts. So first off, broaden your mind and consider most of the issues that you have, especially with optimism or purpose. Um, Most of these things have already been adequately or to a great degree discussed and solved through adverse circumstances in ways that will, if you heard those answers, you will definitely be changed as a person. Okay. Two, check out the Serenity Prayer. Serenity Prayer basically helps show you what is important in the sense of what you could do and to focus on that. Because if you can't tell the difference between what you can and can't do, then you could easily be investing your energies in the wrong place. Three, know that there is a transcendent meaning. Now, as I've said in the other talks, you need to have something fixed, something that can transcend the pain, transcend the moment, transcend the temporary things that you have that are afflicting you. And where do you get that? I personally am a Christian. I think the best case for making sense of life is found in the scriptures, the Christian scriptures, that God is behind the universe. He's the author behind our stories, that reality itself has been created by his hand, and that through Christ you are going to find your fulfillment. And that's a transcendent meaning that is par excellence. You can't get any deeper than that, because reality itself is built by God and it's imbued with meaning. Now, even that is exactly what I believe. There are some issues, though. Since we're just talking about optimism, it is the case that some people are not Christians, but they still are able to be optimistic, and that's worth noting. It would be misleading for me to say that only Christians have ever been able to be optimistic. That would not be true. But here are some other examples. So Homer, thousands of years ago, basically tried to paint these pictures of these heroes. And the Homeric ideal would be something like, you live on in the Odes of your children and children's society, your grandchildren. They basically write songs about your heroic deeds, and in some way you live on. Okay, you live on in the legacy of your family. You are going to make a huge impact on the world. No matter what you do, you're going to make an impact. What type of impact? That's up to you. What do you pursue? Why do you pursue it? What is your vision? You're going to impact them. In Indian philosophy, you have Nirvana, where you break the cycle of reincarnation, or you have reincarnation. If that's the case in Indian philosophy, you definitely are going to be making an impact, and that's going to transcend the moment. So whatever you're feeling right now, you have to put it in context of a larger context, right? Okay. So as I mentioned, I think the Christian answer is the best. But if you want to be optimistic, because you know that it's going to be connected to your success and your happiness, at least your temporal happiness, you need to consider what can allow you to be optimistic. But as I said, you can't believe anything that you want. You can only believe what you can genuinely believe. So this is why I emphasize that this is a theoretical part. So start the discussion in a very broad sense. Humans in general, what have we been working on for centuries? So that basically sets up the scenario of like, what are the questions and what are the answers? In your personal life, note the difference between what you can do and what you can't, and only focus on what you can, because everything else is just a waste of energy. It's kind of like you want to take a pail of water up a mountain, but there's holes in your pail. The first thing you need to do is plug those holes. Okay. And 3, you need to have a transcendent meaning. Okay. Because if you get knocked down every time there's something adverse happening, it makes sense that you are not going to be able to maintain optimism. Okay. So I would suggest looking at some people that, are inspirational, that have gone through some incredibly tough things. How did they do it? What did they say? Okay, so that's a starting point. In closing, I'll point out the next video would be some tips related to the practical part of getting a transcendent meaning. So for instance, say you study, you say, hey, this is the best theory. Okay, so say I become a Christian and I believe that, we live in a context of an eternal God, something like that. What can you do to help establish those practical aspects? Okay, so thank you for listening. Check out my website, commonphilosopher.com. Put in any questions that you have with a message or email. You guys have a great day.